Good evening. I'm Dick Clay, and I'm the president and CEO of the Filson Historical Society. Welcome to what promises to be an exciting, wonderful evening. Thank you for joining us for the Gertrude Polk Brown Lecture Series featuring author Ronald C. White and his book, Lincoln in Private, What His Most Personal Reflections Tell Us About Our Greatest President. There we go. Sorry about that. The Gertrude Polk Brown Lecture is, I think, the most important honor that we, the Filson, can bestow on an author. And so it is a wonderful thing to be able to do that tonight with Dr. White. Initiated in 1993 as a memorial to the life of Gertrude Polk Brown, and made possible by continuous generous support of her daughter, Dace Brown Stubbs, and her grandchildren, Marshall Farrer and Dace Polk Brown, her daughter, Laura Lee Brown, and her grandchildren, Garvin Dieters, Polk Dieters, and Laura Lee Gastus, and her grandsons, G. Garvin Brown IV and Campbell P. Brown. They've really made this lecture series work. The series has brought internationally recognized historians to Louisville. More than 39,000 citizens have learned more about the significant stories of our region, nation, and world because of the Gertrude Polk Brown lectures. So the Filson is grateful for this generosity. Tonight, I'm honored to introduce Ronald C. White as our Gertrude Polk Brown speaker. Ronald White is the New York Times best-selling author of American Ulysses, his biography of Ulysses S. Grant, and 3 books on Abraham Lincoln. One is A. Lincoln, which is widely considered to be a masterpiece, one of the major biographies in Lincoln scholarship in the last 50 years. Then tonight's Lincoln in Private, much shorter, and both are highly readable. I recommend them. White earned his PhD at Princeton University and also achieved a Master of Divinity. He is an ordained Presbyterian minister. He was minister of a Presbyterian church in Colorado Springs between Div School and going back to Princeton to get his PhD. He's taught at UCLA, which was his undergraduate institution, Colorado College, Whitworth University, and Princeton Theological Seminary. He has lectured at the White House. He's been interviewed on PBS NewsHour. He's spoken about Lincoln in England, France, Germany, Italy, Mexico, and New Zealand. He is a reader at the Huntington Library and a senior fellow of the Trinity Forum in Washington, D.C. In addition, if you've noticed recently, C-SPAN came out with its ranking of the presidents, and Ron White has been on the C-SPAN group of historians who rank the presidents both this time and the time before. So without any further ado, it is my pleasure to turn this program over to Dr. Professor Ronald C. White. Ron?
Thank you so much, Dick, and thank you everyone for participating this evening. History is important. I am so grateful for the Filson Historical Society, and biography is important. As Dick has mentioned, I was privileged to participate in the C-SPAN Presidential Historian Survey. They do this 4 times. They've done it 4 times in the 21st century at the conclusion of each presidency. As you may not be surprised, Abraham Lincoln finished first in all 4 of those surveys. We need to say at the outset that Lincoln is a 19th century person. He cannot help us with climate change. He cannot advise what to do in the present conflict with Ukraine and Russia. And yet somehow I believe that he is this transcendent figure who speaks across time. We know a great deal about the public Lincoln, the person who signed the Emancipation Proclamation, who offered the Gettysburg Address and the second inaugural address. But what I want to talk with us this evening about is the private Lincoln, the person behind the public Lincoln, a very private person. It's the year 1863. It's spring. The Civil War is not going well. Protest meetings are taking place all across the nation in the North. In Albany, New York, a protest meeting drafts what is called the Albany Resolves, 10 criticisms of Abraham Lincoln. There is in the Democratic Party what is called the Peace Democrats, or the Copperheads. They want to turn the nation back to, as they said, as it was with slavery. And they are protesting that Lincoln has been a tyrannical despot. So they send these resolves to Lincoln. And Lincoln's habit is to reply to such protest meetings, often writing a letter that will be published in a newspaper. So as he's sitting in his office, beginning to draft this letter, a young Iowa congressman, James Wilson, enters. Observing Lincoln writing, he said, "Oh, for goodness sakes, this is so remarkable that you can sit down and write that letter just from scratch." But Lincoln demurs. He turns, points over to an empty desk, a desk drawer, and says, "It's all in there. It's in disconnected thoughts. I never let one of those ideas escape me." Well, the burden of my book is that these ideas have escaped us. Across the years, Lincoln wrote little notes to himself. He never dated them, never titled them, never signed them. He never thought you and I would be talking about them this evening. I asked the people in Springfield, Illinois, who are doing the Abraham Lincoln Papers Project, a new version of the papers, how many of these notes do we have today? 111 have survived. And I have put the 111 as the appendix to this book so that you can see every one of these notes. Now, the editors, who began as John Hay and John Nicolay, Lincoln's secretaries, they gathered up his papers after Lincoln's assassination. They called them fragments. Why fragments? Because many of them are fragmentary. Lincoln literally ends in the middle of a sentence, in the middle of a word, without a punctuation period, as if you and I were writing a note to ourselves and were turned away by something that interrupted us and never returned to finish the notes. So why have we not seen these notes more clearly across the years? Well, because they're spread out over 9 volumes or 11 volumes of Lincoln's collected papers. And although Lincoln scholars, Lincoln biographers, historians have focused on one or another, we've never quite seen them together. And so the question I'm asking this evening is, what do these notes tell us about the private Lincoln that perhaps we haven't yet seen about the public Lincoln? And let me underscore that Lincoln was a private person. His law partner, William Herndon, said, "Lincoln is the most shut-mouthed man I've ever met in my life." Even though he was the great public speaker, he was very, very private. So what I decided to do was to take, of 111 notes, 12 of these notes in 10 chapters, and try to show different sides of Lincoln. Lincoln was a very logical, rational, thoughtful person. But when he visited Niagara Falls in 1848, he suddenly writes what we would call a very lyrical note. Lincoln spent 24 years as a lawyer compared to only 12 years as an elected politician. He authored some notes for a lecture to lawyers, but we don't think he ever gave the lecture, but we have the notes. The great issue of Lincoln's day in the 1850s was the issue of slavery. Lincoln involved himself in the 7 remarkable debates with Stephen Douglas. But behind those notes, behind those debates, are a number of notes that Lincoln wrote about slavery. And one of the questions about Lincoln that persists to this day is, was he a religious person or not? He did not join a church, which is very, very unusual for American presidents. But is there any indication, perhaps in one of these private notes, of his own faith journey. Well, let's get started. The first note that I want to call to our attention is the note that he wrote when he visited Niagara Falls in 1848. He was campaigning for the then Whig candidate for president. We're not quite there yet. This note that's up on the screen is the one on slavery. So I want to just read something about his note on Niagara Falls. Niagara Falls, by what mysterious power is it that millions and millions are drawn from all parts of the world to gaze upon Niagara Falls? Well, he writes this note, never thinking any of us are going to read it. And when he returns to Springfield, his law partner, William Herndon, who will then present himself after Lincoln's death as Lincoln's greatest interpreter, I know the man better than anyone else, Herndon also recently been to Niagara Falls. Unaware of Lincoln's note, Herndon writes these words. He had no eye for the magnificence and grandeur of the scene, for the rapids, the mist, the angry waters, and the roar of the whirlpool. This Lincoln, according to Herndon, was heedless of beauty and awe. Herndon didn't really know the private Lincoln. Let me read the last several sentences of this fragment. The eyes of that species of extinct giants whose bones fill the mounds of America have gazed on Niagara as ours do now. Contemporary with a whole race of men and older than the first man, Niagara is strong and fresh today as 10,000 years ago. The mammoth and the mastodon, now so long dead that fragments of their monstrous bones alone testify that they ever lived, have gazed on Niagara. In that long, long time, never still for a single moment, never dried, never froze, never slept, never rested, comma, he's not finished. Oh, I need to read one other part of this because it's so remarkable. Niagara calls up the indefinite past when Columbus first sought this continent, when Christ suffered on the cross, when Moses led Israel through the Red Sea, nay, even when Adam first came from the hand of his maker, then as now, Niagara was roaring here. What does this tell us? There is a lyrical side of Lincoln, a poetic side of Lincoln that we don't fully grasp if we don't understand this private Lincoln. The second note I want to bring to our attention, we're not yet ready to put the slide on the screen, is this note for a lecture to lawyers. Lincoln had become one of the great lawyers in Illinois, but the way people studied law in that day was to put themselves in a law office and to be a student, as it were, a reader of the lawyer. But Lincoln spent much of his time out on what was called the 8th Judicial Circuit, a part of Illinois as large as the state of Connecticut. Sometimes he would spend 200 days traveling by horse and buggy or by horse. So he couldn't be in his office. I think he decided to give this lecture for lawyers. This is the way it began. I am not an accomplished lawyer. Can you imagine a modern leader, politician, CEO, lawyer beginning this way? I am not an accomplished lawyer. He was one of the greatest lawyers in Illinois. I find quite as much material for a lecture in those points where I have failed as in those where I have been moderately successful. What a remarkable thing to say. And one other part of this note, discourage litigation. Persuade your neighbors to compromise whenever you can. Point out to them how the nominal winner is often the real loser in fees, expenses, and waste of time. In frontier Illinois, people went to the law against each other. And Lincoln, who had this great sense of community, understood that you might win by the jury or the judge, but you might also lose and destroy the community. As a peacemaker, he argues in this, continuing the note, the lawyer has a superior opportunity of being a good man. I'm sure there's a number of lawyers in the audience this evening. Lincoln was a great war president. He checked books out of the Library of Congress to teach himself to be commander-in-chief. He was looking forward to a second term because he thought he was a better peace president. As a peacemaker, the lawyer has a superior opportunity of being a good man. There will still be business enough. And let's now put up this fragment so you can see the way that Lincoln does write. His handwriting is so clear, it's very, very easy to read. This is the one note that is not in Springfield. It's in a private home in Dallas, Texas. A good friend of mine who has a full-time curator. I find this one of the most remarkable notes of all. You'll notice that some of these notes, you can see it on the screen or when you get the book, if you choose to do so, have a question mark. Remember, I said Lincoln didn't date the notes. So editors are suggesting, often with a question mark, when this might have been written. Lincoln spent one term in Congress, 1847 to 1849. He took a stand against the war with Mexico. He demanded to know from President James Polk where was the spot on which the Mexicans invaded the United States, for he was quite convinced it was actually the opposite. The United States had invaded Texas. When he came home, many of his constituents said, well, thank you very much. We're not going to elect you again. And Lincoln believed he probably had ended his political career. He became a full-time lawyer. But in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed, which allowed the possibility of slavery extending west into the new territories, Kansas, Nebraska, and further west. This infuriated Lincoln, and he came charging back into the political arena. But before he spoke, he wrote these notes to himself. If A can prove, however conclusively, that he may have right enslaved B, why may not B snatch the same argument and prove equally that he may enslave A? You say A is white and B is black. It is color then, the lighter having the right to enslave the darker. Take care. By this rule, you are to be a slave to the first man you meet with a fairer skin than your own. You do not mean color exactly. And notice the way Lincoln underlines the key words here. He does this in his public speeches like the Second Inaugural or Gettysburg, but he also does it in his notes to himself. You do not mean color exactly. You mean whites are intellectually superior to blacks and therefore have the right to enslave them. Take care then. By this rule, you are to be slave to the first man you meet with an intellect superior to your own. But say you, it is a question of interest. And if you can make it your interest, you have the right to enslave another. Very well. If he can make it his interest, he has the right to enslave you. Abraham Lincoln was a person of but 1 year of public education. Boys who worked on farms with their fathers were only afforded education in Kentucky or southern Indiana when it was too cold to work on the farms in January or February, and itinerant teachers would come through that territory and parents would hire that teacher to teach their sons. Lincoln probably did this 5, possibly 6 January and February. And yet here is this person writing this incredible note. Let's put another note up on the screen, the next one. This is the briefest one. You notice how they're all on different kinds of paper, just what I would almost call scraps of paper. This is a fascinating story because it was not found initially by Hay and Nicolay in the papers of Abraham Lincoln in his office after his assassination. This fragment definition is tied to the story of Mary Lincoln. Mary has suffered pretty much under historians and biographers. I'm a little more sympathetic to her. Think of her losing her first son, Eddie, at age 3.5 in 1850, second son, Willie, in 1862, then her husband in 1865, then 3 years later, her next son, Tad. So in 1875, in a trial in Chicago, in a jury of 12 men, she was convicted of insanity and placed in a mental insane asylum for female patients in Bellevue, Illinois. Fortunately for her, Myra Bradwell, the first female lawyer in Illinois, took it upon herself with her husband to try to have Mary get Mary out of the insane asylum. And after 4 or 5 weeks, she did so. In gratitude, Mary gave Myra Bradwell some of the gifts that she had kept, that her husband had, gifts that often had been given by foreign leaders, but she also gave her this remarkable definition, so brief: as I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. Notice the underlines. This expresses my idea of democracy. Whatever differs from this, to the extent of the difference, is no democracy. If we would follow Lincoln's career, we would learn that he learned to be more and more concise. His first speeches were long and wordy, sometimes verbose, but as he gets finally to the Gettysburg Address and then to the second inaugural address, they are so brief. I love this definition. What I've learned from Douglas Wilson, wonderful Lincoln scholar at Knox College in Illinois, is Lincoln's use of the negative. Shakespeare used the negative. An interesting way to do a definition, isn't it? As I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. This expresses my idea of democracy. Whoever differs from this, to the extent of the difference, is no democracy. Lincoln began by trying to understand the tragedy of slavery, the effect of slavery upon African Americans. But as he entered into his own conversations with himself and in his own observations of American society, he came to the understanding that actually slavery was also terrible for white people, for those who were the masters. For this was the undoing of both sides of the equation. And here he expresses it so perfectly. I'm asking the question, what does the private Lincoln tell us that is not present in the public Lincoln? Let me turn to another fragment, not yet one to be put on the screen. In 1855 and early 56, Lincoln ran for the United States Senate. You may remember that senators were elected by state legislatures until the early 20th century. Lincoln ran for Senate in Illinois, and he led on the first 7 ballots, and his campaign was against the Kansas-Nebraska Act, against the extension of slavery. But by the 7th ballot, he came to the understanding that he could not win, even though he was leading at that time. His worry was that another Republican candidate who was for the Kansas-Nebraska Act would win. And so Lincoln shifted his votes. Think about this in today's politics. He shifted his votes to a Democrat who was against the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and that person won the election. Well, in public, Lincoln was very magnanimous. He was very fine. I'm okay. I'll get along. Remember, his greatest goal in life was to become the United States Senator. He never thought of becoming president. But in a note to himself that no one knew about until now we're reading it in this book, he wrote 22 years ago, Stephen Douglas, the real enemy in the election was Douglas, because Douglas was the author of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. We can date this note because of 22 years ago, Stephen Douglas and I first became acquainted. We were both young then, he a trifle younger than I. Even then, we were both ambitious, I perhaps quite as much as he. With me, the race of ambition has been a failure, a flat failure. Let me say that again. Abraham Lincoln is saying, for his eyes only, with me, the race of ambition has been a failure, a flat failure. Lincoln did not share his feelings in public. Remember, I said he was a very rational person. But here privately, not believing anyone would ever see this note, he admits to himself that he is a failure. In 3.5 years, he would be elected president of the United States. Let's do one more fragment before we open it up to your comments and questions. Let's put on the screen this last one, which does, if you see at the top, sometimes you can see at the top, not here, but this is a fragment that Lincoln wrote in 1862. Now we're in the middle of the Civil War. The North has lost one battle after another. At the end of August 1862, they lost the Battle of Second Manassas, or Second Bull Run. The title is different depending upon whether one says so from the South or the North. Lincoln convenes an emergency cabinet meeting. He is really distraught. I'm so pleased that cabinet secretaries then kept diaries. And in one of the diaries, the Attorney General writes, Lincoln said he was so distraught that he almost thought of hanging himself. But we believe on September 2nd, 1862, that very afternoon, he sat down and wrote this amazing fragment. But let me read it for us. You can read it. Isn't it wonderful to see how clear Lincoln's handwriting is? It's very easy to read. The will of God prevails. In great contests, each party claims to act in accordance with the will of God. Both may be and one must be wrong. God cannot be for and against the same thing at the same time. The logical Lincoln speaking. And then this profound sentence. In the present Civil War, it is quite possible that God's purpose is something different from the purpose of either party. And yet the human instrumentalities, working just as they do, are the best adaptation to effect his purpose. I'm almost ready to say that this is probably true, that God wills this contest and wills that it shall not end yet. By his mere quiet power, Lincoln had grown tired of the noisy God he met in the Second Great Awakening in Kentucky and Southern Indiana, the churches that his parents attended. He rebelled as a young man against that kind of noisy, emotional religion. And we'll talk about, perhaps in the questions and comments, how he comes back into a different kind of faith as a mature adult. By his mere quiet power on the minds of the now contestants, he could have either saved or destroyed the Union without a human contest. And having begun, he could give the final victory to either side any day. What are you saying, President Lincoln? He could give the final victory to either side? Are you suggesting he could give the final victory to the Confederacy? Well, you can see why this is a private note. Lincoln didn't ever expect anyone to see it. He was kind of puzzling out for himself. Where is God in the midst of the Civil War? We have the soldiers, the generals, he as commander-in-chief. But you see, this note is suggesting that there's another actor in the Civil War, that God is a God who acts in history. And so he concludes, yet the contest proceeds. Now, my first encounter with Lincoln and my first attempt to write a book on him focused on Lincoln's second inaugural address. On March 4, 1865, in 701 words, Lincoln would mention God 14 times, quote the Bible 4 times, invoke prayer 3 times. No one in the audience that day knew that he had written this private meditation for himself 2.5 years earlier. And in the chapter in Lincoln in Private, I line up the meditation on the divine will and the second inaugural address and wish to show that they are very parallel, that this is really the foundation of the second inaugural address. So this is part of what it means for Lincoln in private. He is trying out, he is teasing out, he is thinking about ideas that perhaps one day, in this case, 2.5 years later, he will then bring into public view. In conclusion, I enjoy speaking to high school students. I've had the privilege of speaking to high school students from Massachusetts to Hawaii, often 11th graders. That's when they are studying American history. And I've tried out with them these fragments or these notes. And I will often conclude by asking these high school students, how long do you think it took Lincoln to write these notes? And the 11th graders will often say, oh, a minute or 3 minutes or 5 minutes. And then I say, how about an hour or 2 or 3? And in one particular class, the faculty was applauding in the back of the room when I made that suggestion. What are we saying here? That behind the public Lincoln, the person who did all of these remarkable acts on behalf of our wonderful American democracy, is a private Lincoln, a person who, with his thinking and his emotion, is trying to understand the great issues of his day and bringing to those issues a whole set of values. In the last case, a set of religious values, of Christian values that undergirds everything that he says. So across time, we remind ourselves again, and perhaps those who wish to take down monuments and those who wish to take names off of schools, that it's important to understand people in their own day, 18th century, 19th century, 20th century. I wonder what they will think of us in the next century. But Lincoln is also that transcendent figure. What I'm trying to offer to you and to others, the idea that underneath this great public figure who does deserve to be our greatest president, is a person struggling with the great ideas. And if we can get in touch with this private Lincoln, we can see him also as a model, as an example in our own day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. White. That was absolutely outstanding. Really appreciate it. There are a number of questions, and I'm going to use my trifocals to look at the chat. And so if I peer in, everybody just bear with me. Yes. Are these fragments the closest Lincoln came to keeping a journal or a diary?
That's a wonderful question. We don't have a journal or a diary. We're so grateful that, say, someone like Ulysses S. Grant, who knew he was dying from cancer, gave to us his remarkable personal memoirs, one of the great memoirs in American history. So yes, I would say this is the closest thing to a personal diary or journal. When I say there's 111, there were only one survived from the 1830s, only 6 from the 1840s. At that time, Lincoln was a young man sleeping in the back of a store in New Salem, boarding with people in that same village. Not an easy way to keep track of all the notes that he had. It's very possible that even his son, Robert, who became the custodian of the notes, perhaps didn't save all of them, thinking, well, these are not public documents. But I think he wrote hundreds and hundreds of these notes. And if you take them all together, yes, this is a kind of personal diary or memoir.
What led you to Lincoln in the first place, and how has your opinion of Lincoln changed by studying and living with these fragments?
I was teaching history at UCLA in Southern California, and the Huntington Library mounted in 1993-94 at that time, the greatest exhibit ever on Lincoln. They brought things from Springfield, Illinois, and Louise Taper, the greatest private collector, lived in Beverly Hills. I was teaching history, and I thought, well, wouldn't this be interesting to bring students to the exhibit? I'm looking for ways to get students involved, and I'll find somebody at the Huntington to give them a lecture on Lincoln, not me. So we all read a Lincoln anthology, Lincoln's letters and speeches, and I got hooked. I remembered as a child, or really as a teenager, I had read a biography of Lincoln, but I'd sort of long forgotten that. I felt I was pretty much a Johnny-come-lately entering this field, but I, along with my students, found myself just fascinated by this person, Abraham Lincoln.
Is there any evidence that Lincoln's 1841 stay at Farmington here in Louisville with the Speeds had any influence on his thinking about slavery?
I visited Farmington there, yes. And of course, as everyone I'm sure in your audience knows, why Joshua Speed was his best friend. He came to Farmington after kind of a temporary dissolution of his relationship with Mary. He was in a very bad way. Joshua Speed's mother gave him a King James Bible, which he treasured for the rest of his life. This was still 1841. He had, while he was in Indiana, he had taken a boatload of goods down to New Orleans. And while there, he was really quite taken aback by the spectacle of slavery, seeing men on one side of the Mississippi River, women and children on the other side, recognizing that marriage was not legal in slavery. He was taken aback by it, but he was a long way from his thinking, more mature thinking about slavery. Yeah.
Now, I think I remember a phrase that he wrote to one of the Speeds, maybe to Mary Speed, about the slaves being taken in coffles and describing like fish on a chain.
You know, he was greatly offended by what he saw. Absolutely, yeah. So your question you ask, or the comment you make, Dick, really raises the question for all of us: what is the intersection of experience and ideas? How does our experience change our ideas, or perhaps our ideas change our experience? And how are those experiences, especially when we're young, then we kind of move forward, and perhaps then we put some ideas behind them? And I think this is what happened. Lincoln had an experiences, but then his ideas as a more mature person began to deal with this issue of slavery. Yeah.
This is an interesting question. Would Lincoln's note for Kentuckians in February 1861, the one that was, I think, never published, or he never gave a speech, would that be good advice for Americans today?
Well, I think it would, and let's just refresh our memory as to what this is, because it is one of the chapters in my book. Lincoln, so interesting as we think of January 6th, there was a threat that the counting of the electoral votes would be interrupted in 1861. And Seward advised Lincoln to come immediately to stop this threat. But Lincoln said, no, I'm going to take my trip. I think going this long 13-day trip will be very important in allowing us to kind of marshal support for the Union. But then, almost unknown to many people, is he wrote notes for a lecture in Kentucky. Now, in 1859, he had spoken in Cincinnati, and people from Kentucky had crossed the Ohio River. And in that speech, he talked about my fellow Kentuckians. So he wrote this speech not on the train, but he wrote it in Springfield because it's pasted to the back of the first draft of his first inaugural address. And in one sense, he reaches out to the Kentuckians, but in another sense, he says, I don't think any of you would want the person you voted for to change their point of view. This is my point of view. It's very clear what I believe. And if you don't like my point of view, you will have a chance to elect someone else. So in one sense, it's very affirming of Kentuckians, but it's also very firm. This is what I believe.
Yeah. Here's one. And it's a bit cryptic, and yet it's very thought-provoking. Divine intervention, Washington crossing the Delaware, Lincoln looking for a victory in which to believe. To what extent, when he wrote his theological fragments, was he looking for or hoping for divine intervention, something tangible to grasp?
Well, this pushes us back to what is the nature, or what is the content of Lincoln's faith. I started to say that Lincoln, in growing up in Kentucky and Indiana, was part of the Second Great Awakening, very emotional. His parents attended Baptist churches. He rejected that. And when he moved to New Salem, he actually wrote a paper criticizing what he called revealed religion, criticizing the Bible. He was reading some Enlightenment authors, and someone who snatched it out of his hand and tossed it in the fire. Not a good thing to do if you're an aspiring politician, to criticize Orthodox Christianity. But then I like to say life tumbled in. First, the death of Eddie in 1850, then 1862, Willie. And the missing person in the story of Lincoln is Phineas Densmore Gurley, minister of the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, #1 in his class at Princeton Seminary. And what he was preaching, and his sermons are at the Presbyterian Historical Society in Philadelphia, was providence. So in a sense, Lincoln began as almost a deist, or what he called the doctrine of necessity. If there's a God, it's kind of a watchmaker God who's in the sky but doesn't intervene. But the preaching of providence is all about a God who does enter into history, who is a God of personality. And that's the God that Lincoln will finally invoke in the second inaugural. It's the God that he invokes in this meditation on the divine will. When I use the title Meditation on the Divine Will, John Hay gave it the title, Lincoln did not. So yes, to his time, he believed that God acted in history, and this is part of his core belief.
I think by what you've just said, you've answered the next question, but I'm going to read it to you anyway. And
yes,
if it helps you, or if you can elaborate, could it be that Lincoln's use of the word God is ironic, that providence ultimately seems to cast no weight to favor one side or the other?
Well, here again, this is so interesting. In the second inaugural, Lincoln will say, the Almighty has his own purposes. Now, on the one hand, Lincoln is not so arrogant to say, and I know what those purposes are. But on the other hand, he is saying, very affirming, God has his own purposes. So both are true at the same time. Lincoln believes God acts in history, but he's not saying, I know exactly, because his concern was people were coming to him to say, God is on our side. And he knew they were coming to Jefferson Davis to say, God is on our side. And he didn't like this. He did not like the ministers or the politicians who were so sure of where God was and what God was doing. This was not Abraham Lincoln.
Well, and in the book, you do talk about Lincoln's views on, and it's in the fragments, on the biblical justifications, so to speak, for slavery that
Yes.
ministers were enunciating from the pulpit and in written tracts. And there were some here in Louisville, in fact, at my own church, by a minister long ago named Stuart Robinson. How did Lincoln address that, the theological thundering from the pulpit justifying slavery?
Well, Dick, the question or comment allows me to talk about Lincoln's habits of reading. When he returned from that single term in Congress, he decided that he would want to subscribe to several of the national anti-slavery newspapers. But then he so surprised his law partner Herndon he said, but I also want to subscribe to a leading newspaper from Richmond and a leading newspaper from Charleston. And Herndon said, well, why in the world would you do that? Because he said, we need both sides at the table. Both sides at the table. Wouldn't it be wonderful today if we had both sides at the table? So during the debates with Douglas, he buys this wonderful in a sense, book, Slavery Ordained by God, written by a Southern Presbyterian minister, Huntsville, Alabama. The book was really a kind of a bestseller among pro-slavery advocates. And Lincoln read this book very, very carefully. Now, he writes a note against it, He's angry about it, but he took the time to try to understand what is the pro-slavery argument and why is it so persuasive. And I think this says so much about Lincoln, the political leader.
Here's a fun one. And it resonates with me because I used the movie Lincoln that came out in 2012. I used it as I was teaching Kentucky history to a group of high school seniors.
Oh, good for you.
Oh, it was fun. Here's the question. How accurate do you think the portrayal of Lincoln was in the movie Lincoln? I think, wasn't Lincoln played by Daniel Day-Lewis?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. What was it an accurate portrayal?
Well, I've seen the Lincoln movie 7 times. I took my
I thought it was great.
I took my grandchildren to it because if you think of it, it's such a different kind of movie. Most movies today are all action. This is a movie about ideas. It's all about public speech. It's very unusual. And you may know that Daniel Day-Lewis, as I understand it, while he was playing this role, played it 24 hours a day. 24 hours a day. He wanted to really inhabit Lincoln, and he did. Now, it's not completely accurate, and the filmmakers knew it. For example, Connecticut, to make it more dramatic, voted against the 13th Amendment. Well, of course, Connecticut voted for the 13th Amendment. This is a New England state. So all the historians got upset and they wrote to the director, and the director said, well, thank you very much, but we're not changing the story. But I don't think that Lincoln would have slapped Robert Lincoln as he does in the movie.
Mm-hmm.
But by and large, I think it's a very fair portrayal of Lincoln and a very good portrayal of Mary, and probably a good portrayal of Seward also. Yeah, I like it.
Another question. Given the fact that these fragments have been around, easily accessible by anyone who wanted to read them, since Nicolay and Hay published their 10-volume biography or their biography still, should we be exposing Lincoln's private thoughts if Lincoln never thought they'd be revealed?
That's a good question. I haven't been asked that question before.
I hadn't thought of that one either. And my first reaction was, whoa.
Well,
and yet
I guess
it's a sensible question. It's a good question.
After all these years, there's no copyright. And I think all of us want to know the notes are not damning of Lincoln. By the way, no one has asked this question, but let me answer it. Lincoln in the notes does not talk about Mary, does not talk about his children, does not talk about his family. What may have happened when Mary Lincoln was leaving Springfield in 1861 to go to Washington, she went out in the back alley and burned much correspondence. People did that in the 19th century. They didn't want, husband didn't, or wife didn't want, this is personal. This is their marriage. It's possible that Lincoln might have had notes that had to do with family or friends or Joshua Speed or whoever. But the notes that we have now are all about politics and economics and religion and the tariff and things like that. There is no personal dimension of these notes. I'm not saying he didn't write something on these notes. I don't think he probably did, but if he did, he destroyed them.
Where was Lincoln at various times in his life on slavery? And did he, how did he deal with the issue of equality in the eyes of God? Did he see them both as equal? And was he interested at all in what Henry Clay had, I think, originated or was formative in, and that was the American Emancipation Society? And Kentucky had an affiliate, of course.
Well, Lincoln is on a journey. And again, one of my frustrations with the present movement to take away names, and we don't give people credit for being on a journey. So when Lincoln came through Lexington on his first and only term in Congress, it just so happened that Henry Clay was speaking, and he went to hear Henry Clay. And Henry Clay, who was a slaveholder, was also very critical of the war with Mexico because he thought that many people in the South were going to use the war with Mexico as a way to extend slavery south into Mexico and literally expand the United States border. So Lincoln called Clay his beau ideal of a statesman. His whole understanding was really formed by Clay. On the other hand, when you say the colonization society, Lincoln did support that way up into the middle of his presidency, which has now become the fodder for many, many people to criticize him. And yet he then just stopped it. In 1862, he got together with the border states and offered them a form of emancipation. He said, I will pay for your slaves all the way to 1895 so you can gradually emancipate them. And when they turned him down flatly, he then drafted the first draft of an Emancipation Proclamation. So we heard no more of the Colonization Society. What he said in the Colonization Society was, well, it may not be possible that blacks and whites can live together, but what we forget is that a number of African-American church leaders were very much involved in the Colonization Society because they saw this as a way to missionize Africa, to go back to Liberia and to bring the Christian gospel to Africa. So Lincoln's on a journey. And sometimes we don't understand, he's moving from maybe a more conservative to kind of a left of center. His trial and his tribulation with the abolitionists is, he thinks they're pretty self-righteous. And he's very much against anybody who's self-righteous. He's on a journey with his religious faith. And I think one of my concerns is we don't allow him to be on that journey.
Is there anything in the notes that surprised you or was contrary to popular thinking on Abraham Lincoln?
Several things. First, I was not familiar, had not paid attention to the Niagara fragment, which lifts up a wonderfully lyrical Lincoln, who is not at all understood by the person who thought he was closest to him, William Herndon. I've long been interested in not simply in Lincoln, but in the whole faith stories of our American leaders. I feel that we have overlooked this or downplayed it or said, oh, that was the 19th century or the 18th century. Lincoln's theological thinking is very deep and very profound. That encouraged me to see even more about that. The fragment about his admitting his failure, that was quite surprising. I'd never really taken the time to look at the potential speech to Kentucky. That was interesting too. So there's a number of elements here that I think lift up a different side of Lincoln than most of us have seen before.
He lost an election. Did he ever have anything to say about what happens when a politician loses an election?
Well, of course, he's a flat failure when he loses that election. And then he lost the election to Stephen Douglas in 1858. And now we're all involved in conversations about gerrymandering. Well, if you look at the popular vote in 1858, Lincoln won. But 1858 Illinois was also gerrymandered. And so he lost because the election was held in the legislature. He lost the legislative vote. But if you tally up the popular vote, he defeated Stephen Douglas in that election.
What did he say about that experience?
Well, he was in one sense quite proud. He actually arranged to have these Douglas-Lincoln debates or Lincoln-Douglas debates published. He thought that this did give him a kind of a public, maybe a national standing. I don't think he was yet thinking of himself as running for president, but this did give him a national standing. And it ultimately prompted his invitation to speak at Cooper Union in the winter of 1860. And so he was becoming a national figure, not simply an Illinois figure. And the irony of this is this, that on the one hand, he had the misfortune of being in the same state with Stephen Douglas. But on the other hand, he had the fortune of being in the same state with Stephen Douglas because this brought him into national spotlight.
Yeah. And I loved the story that I'd never heard of or had forgotten of Douglas being at Lincoln's presidential inauguration.
Yeah.
And tell them about that, if you would.
Well, this is just remarkable. First of all, when the war breaks out, Douglas is one of the very first people, this is later, will come to Lincoln and say, I'm with you. But at the inauguration, as Lincoln is kind of fumbling with his hat and his spectacles and his speech and all these sorts of things, Douglas steps forward and says, "Sir, may I hold that for you?" What a mark of respect. Douglas had lost that election. He was a presidential candidate in 1860, but he had a deep respect for Abraham Lincoln.
Do the fragments reveal his thinking as a practical politician, the nitty-gritty of getting elected and the role that ambition has to play, I suppose, in a politician's desire to rise?
It does. I think it is, as you are almost suggesting here, the delicate balance, isn't it, between ambition and humility. Lincoln was a machine politician, and I think that was one of the purposes of the Lincoln movie, to show he was a machine politician. So when he is running, for example, that term in the Senate, he's sending out letters all across the state saying, "I think I've got these votes. Can you help me with these votes?" And in the notes, he's actually keeping track of the votes, keeping track of the potential votes and then of the actual votes. And even as president, he has a kind of a cheat sheet where he's keeping track of the votes he thinks in 1864. So he's a very practically minded Republican leader.
One last question, and then we can close. To what extent, and you've answered this directly or indirectly, but this is a good way to end. To what extent did Lincoln's views against slavery change over time, and how do these private notes help us understand these changes?
They did change over time, and I think the notes, even as we talked about earlier, being a memoir or a diary, they allow us to see how it changes over time. The Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854 brought him back into the political arena. At first, he was really concerned with the effect of slavery on African Americans, but he came to see that its effect could also be on white Americans. And even though the Northwest Territory had at its inception sort of outlawed the extension of slavery, he saw the possibility that slavery could actually be extended to the North, that there would be states, including his own, that might vote to have slavery. And so the enormity of the issue of slavery grew in him. He also saw this as not simply an American issue, that this is an issue for the whole world, an issue of what is the meaning of freedom and what is the meaning of democracy. And I think this grew as he grew as a politician.
Wow. I'm going to read you one comment, and it's a great way to end. This is from a Filson member saying, "Thank you to all involved. Wish it could have been in person, but this was great." Thank you very, very, very much. And you have a standing invitation to visit Louisville when the pandemic is over, and it will end. We look forward to having you back. Thank you so much.
And I will accept the invitation. Thank you for the privilege of being with you today.
You bet. And thank you for all the people, the descendants of Gertrude Polk Brown, who have made this possible. We're enormously grateful. Thank you. Night, everybody.